Welcome to the Defense Acquisition University. This material is for nonprofit educational use only. Speakers' views and opinions are not necessarily those of the Department of Defense or DAU.
I have the honor and the privilege to introduce our first keynote speaker, Dr. Alan Kay. Anyone who's had a desktop computer would owe it to Dr. Kay. So I'm going to read his bio, so you can look in the conference symposium as well. Dr. Kay is one of the earliest pioneers of object-oriented programming, personal computing, and graphical user interfaces. His contributions have been recognized with the Charles Stark Draper Prize of the National Academy of Engineering, the Alan M. Turing Award from the Association of Computing for Fundamental Contributions to Personal Computing, and the Keynote Prize for creation of the concept of modern personal computing and contribution to its realization. He has been elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the Royal Society of the Arts, the Association for Computing Machinery, and the Computer History Museum. He has been a Xerox Fellow, Chief Scientist of Atari, Apple Fellow, Disney Fellow, and Hewlett-Packard Senior Fellow. He's currently an adjunct professor.
And a jolly good fellow.
And a jolly good fellow.
I think that's more. That's
okay.
Plenty. Thank
All
you.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Since we're talking about new, I thought it would be a bad idea to dwell too much on the past. And, in a different setting, I'd love to give a talk about George Mason, because he's always been one of my heroes, and I had the interesting experience of explaining to the cabbie who drove me over here who George Mason was. So I think he was one of the two or three most important people in the American Revolution and in the design of our country, and yet for a variety of reasons, partly because he was a man of few words, he's kind of been lost. But one of the great birthday presents I ever got was the collected letters of Madison and Jefferson to each other. So if you have any interest in history, this is a great thing. It's about 2,000 letters. It's 3 big volumes. And it reads like email correspondence between people engaged in serious business. Maybe every 10th one is, gee, I miss you, when can we get together? They both lived in Virginia, but they were a far distance apart. But about every 5th letter in their discussions about how to make a country were, we should go over and talk to George Mason about this. They regarded him as the smartest guy around. And George Mason, of course, was engaged in something that was very difficult even for the people who were making the American Revolution, which is in the newness of it. And in fact, Jefferson and Madison, in their letters, one of them was about, a series of them actually, were about maybe we should have a constitutional convention every 25 or 50 years. And the reason is that there was going to be progress, a new idea, an idea that came in almost with the 17th and 18th century. They knew the world in front of them was going to be different successively, not just from what they were doing now, but successively. And so they wondered whether they could even draft a document that would last for this progression of new things. And previously, virtually every human being born on on the planet Earth died in the same world in which they were born. So think about that. So the idea of progress is not actually even built into our nervous system. What is built in is coping. So we're great copers, and for most of our history on the planet, we've had to cope. And in fact, training, to a very large extent, is about coping, because it's about things that exist and how to get relatively facile with things that exist. Very few things that people take training courses in are foreign to them when they start the training. So I thought for this conference it would be interesting to talk about what would it mean to learn something new, because if there's anything that I think is notable about the last 400 years, and especially the last 100 years, and especially the last 50, and especially the last 20, is that the world has been different for each generation. And when newness and the technology that can come along with it goes faster than education, you always wind up with a pop culture. So, for example, the computing culture, even in universities today, is by and large a pop culture. It is not what you would call a professional culture. Computer science used to mean something 40 years ago, but now it actually means a grab bag of stuff that is reactive to what's actually going on and being done by most people. And that is very, very different than a developed culture. So since we're in Virginia here, I thought it'd be interesting to start off with the way people think about fighting wars. So you may know that wars up to and including the Civil War were primarily with one group of people standing in full view of another group of people, and first with swords and then with rifles, just shooting each other. And this was regarded as okay because the foot soldiers weren't in the same social class as the generals. And as Grant said, I can stand this line all summer. He had more troops than the Confederacy, and so he just planned to use them up. And at the end, he would have some and they would have none, and so he would win this battle. That was the way they fought then. And the thing that got them thinking other thoughts was the invention of the rifle, which made it a very different kind of proposition. And so the way of dealing with the rifle was to dig trenches. You may remember this from history, but the problem with trenches is that you could make tanks. The tanks just ignored the people in the trenches with puny little rifles and would just go running across. And the tanks were so devastating in World War I that the French built the Maginot Line all across the border between France and Germany. And everybody hear of the Maginot Line? Really? Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. So the Maginot Line, they spent billions on it, and you can see at the top it was essentially the fence we're trying to build between the U.S. and Mexico, but more elaborate enough not just to stop people, but to stop all of the heavy machinery of World War I. And you can see it had underground tunnels and these concrete bunkers and up all the way across the entire border. So hundreds of miles of Maginot Line. And but unfortunately the Germans fooled them by flying over it, because World War II wasn't primarily about tanks. It was about two new weapons, planes and U-boats. And the interesting thing is the planes and U-boats existed in World War I, but nobody who fought in World War I could understand what were going to happen to planes and U-boats by the time World War II came around. So they went from being a curiosity to the most devastating weapons. The U-boats were completely they were the most potent weapon in the early war because they could destroy supply lines, and they did. And so the weapon that was the most decisive one in World War II was actually radar. And we think of things like the atomic bomb, or because it's flashy, literally flashy. But radar was the biggie, and the British almost killed it. They invented it, but the guy who was head of science and technology, supposedly for the British Ministry of War, didn't believe in stuff like radar and planes, and so he almost killed it. So the British brought it over to the U.S., who was not in the war yet. And radar was actually developed around MIT in Cambridge and won the war for us. And then we worried a lot about this kind of war. And while we're worrying and dealing with that kind of war, we actually wound up with this one. So one of the ways of thinking about it, and this is, I didn't want to just talk about war, but one of the sponsors is part of the defense of the United States. So it's worthwhile bringing that in. But basically, if you look at American business, to a large extent, if you look at universities, you'll see this really interesting problem. And McLuhan summed this up by saying we are forced to experience the present in terms of the past. And it seems completely reasonable, doesn't it? Because all we have to draw on is the past. And we've gotten competent at the past, we've coped with the past, we've learned the past, we've trained about the past, and the past is familiar. And we look at news on television in terms of the past. This is what news means. News is something that you can be told in a minute or two because it has almost no information in it that's new. Right? There's a new earthquake, but it's an earthquake. There's a new mudslide, but it's a mudslide. There's a new border insurgency, but we've heard of those. So the news that our nervous system likes is completely predicated on being slight increments to what we know. And in fact, the things we like to learn are slight increments on what we know. So one of the big dilemmas in school is the huge dilemma of trying to deal with people who want to learn stuff that is relevant to them. So we have this in college today. Relevancy is the big problem in the technical fields. So the kids come in and they have an idea of what they want to do. And in fact, in a real technical field, and them coming from a typical American high school, they actually have no background of any kind for making any kind of decision about what it is that they should be doing. They simply don't know enough, but they want it to be relevant. And of course, marketing is all about relevancy and establishing relevancy. So these are interesting problems. And most training, which is a cruder way of assessing the term e-learning, most e-learning is about training because it is about taking something that everybody understands as a problem, something large enough and visible enough so people are willing to pay for it, set up courses and so forth, and now we're going to train you in it. And this works great for classical music. I'm a classical pipe organist, and training just really works there because there's so much technique to learn, and Beethoven isn't rewriting his symphonies. So we can get really, really good at that stuff. And you can think of classical music, which I adore, as kind of the Maginot Line of music. But I also was a professional jazz musician. And jazz has a lot of stuff you can learn also, but it also has this demand of being able to come up with the newest things you can come up with on the spot. So it has a very different dynamic. So let's take a look at this idea. So when the printing press came along in 1450, the books were printed. This is a Gutenberg Bible, printed to look as much like an existing handwritten manuscript of the day as possible. In fact, they brought in, so the idea of printing was to make inexpensive, coming down from about $2 million dollars to $3 million in today's money, today's dollars, for a Bible. So the precious stones they would put on the cover of the Bible were nothing compared to what it cost to actually copy one, to about $60,000 in today's money for a Bible. So that was a huge change, but in order to make it familiar, Gutenberg brought in people to illuminate these things by hand. They were called rubricators. And so the result, and Gutenberg also imitated everything that the scribes did. So he had actually 253 separate characters in his font. And the result was something that was an imitation of what people already knew. And people marveled, actually, at the Nuremberg Book Fair in 1454, how alike these things were to each other. They'd never seen anything like that before. And 150 years later, we get new, having nothing to do with the Gutenberg Bible or what was written in the Gutenberg Bible or anything the Gutenberg Bible had to say. It was all about science and governance. And the true message of the printing press was it was an ideal form for expressing much more structured thought than you need for talking about religion. It was for a new kind of argument. And only a few people in the 1400s actually suspected this. For most people, they just took it as what it seemed to be, and it took 150 years for Europe to learn what it really was. When Europe learned what it really was, our world changed in the largest way it has ever changed in history. Because not just science happened for the first time for real, but we also got democratic republics all over, and a complete change in the way governance and the way people were looked at. And we can think of the same kind of idea for computing. So when computing first came along, it was not clear even what it was, but today it's very familiar to people because one of the things you can do with a computer is to make it look like existing media. And pretty much everybody who uses a computer uses most of it for most of the day as an imitation of old stuff like printing and text and doing movies, and we can imitate. Here's one of the first. There's a little movie of the first little animation program, and of course we can get a little painting system, and we can paint a little something here, a little bug. So we get a little thing here, and we can even do something that's a little bit new, which is to write a little script for it. So, for instance, let's call this bug here. So I can say, okay, let's make bug go forward by 5, and what I want to do here is I'm going to make a little robot bug. So I want my bug to be able to completely circumnavigate in a regular surface. So I'm going to say, well, if the bug's little sensor sees the desktop, then I'm going to turn the bug by 10 clockwise, and if it doesn't see the desktop, it means it's touching something else. I'm going to turn it by -10, like that. And so if I set this thing going here, so we can see that it's wandering in there, and then it finds that it's inside something, so it tries to get out of something. And right, so this is a little thing that children learn. Now, it turns out most adults don't learn how to do this, so this is half new for adults. And it turns out most computer science students never get the program this simply, even though it is can be done simply. It's been done simply this way for more than 40 years. Because most programming today is done with things that are essentially imitation punch cards and files that are imitation stacks of punch cards. And the process today, even in university, even probably in George Mason University, is a little different than what it was in the 60s. And in all of this, what's actually new about computing has been lost. Not lost, because there are some people who know what it is, but in fact it's been completely covered up the way the Gutenberg Bible was covered up. And in fact, I can't even give you a talk about what's new about computing, because it is new. And what does new mean? New means invisible. News means tiny little increment on something you already know. Earthquake here, but new is invisible. New is quark. I could give you a talk on quarks if I had a few days. And to talk about, and it would take me probably a week to really take you through what's new about computers. Not because you lack anything to understand it, but you have no basis for building on this. So I have to teach you a bunch of things in order to teach you a bunch of things, in order to teach you a bunch of things, and then I can teach you what's actually new. So this is what new is about. New is invisible. And it just happens that a lot of the things that we're dealing with today were completely invisible 400 years ago. That's why I'm giving this talk. Because most of the things we should be worrying about now, and we should be finding out ways to find out about and deal with and learn about, are completely invisible right now. So no university is teaching them. No e-learning group is helping people learn them. So here's something that was regarded as complete bullshit back in 1968, but it's a little cartoon I made after visiting Seymour Papert, seeing his work with children. I started thinking about what a children's computer would be like in the future, and this is very easy to do. It's one of the easiest things I ever did, and I've become famous for doing this extremely easy thing. So all I did was to think about who is a kid, what kinds of things do they need to learn science and math, what's a fun way of learning them? Well, making things. And in fact, there are some wonderful video games that were already on the scene, like Space War. And instead of having them play Space War as the first thing, I thought, well, let's have them make a Space War, because then they have to learn about some physics and stuff, and 11 and 12-year-olds can do this. And so what kind of a computer would we make for them? And the answer is, well, you better make one that they can carry around. And how big is an 11-year-old? And what does it mean? I mean, portable means you can carry something else, too. So luggable is not portable. So I made a cardboard model of this and filled it up with lead shotgun pellets to see how heavy you could make it before you didn't want to carry it around. And so it was all very simple. It was, less than 2 pounds, had a flat screen display, and looks a lot like an iPad. And it's not a coincidence, because, of course, I work for Apple, and Steve Jobs visited us at Xerox PARC to see all the stuff we were doing. And so the iPad is something like this idea in many respects. And what we thought we were doing was to make, the Apple phrase back then was wheels for the mind. It's a great idea, because the automobiles for the mind are not, right? Automobiles, you get flabby. But bikes are great because you can go full out, all your capacity full out on a bike, and it amplifies that. So the idea was, boy, it'd be great to let people go full out with their minds, and we'll amplify that. What we don't want to do is give them a prosthetic like a car. And we thought we were making new things like microscopes and new things like books, and this little X factor idea here. It's off the screen with this projector. But we also knew about Arthur C. Clarke here, science fiction writer, who had formulated laws, and his third law said any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And we knew this but we didn't know it well enough because we thought if we made a really great set of examples at Xerox PARC, that would demagify everything, but in fact it didn't. It didn't even come close to demagifying. For most people today, this stuff is magic. And what happens when you give a wonderful new scientific tool like a microscope to a primate, they can't imagine what to do except look at themselves in their own reflection. So this is the metaphor for our age, along with Guitar Hero. But I think this is a better one. So if you look at what most people do with computers today is they basically admire their own reflection in it. The most successful application in history with 500 million people in it is what? Facebook. Right? So all of the stuff you can do with this, all the ways you can think yourselves out of your human dilemmas and everything else have been completely bypassed by a combination of marketing people who want to sell to people as they are and to people who don't even realize that they are. So we can ask what happens to new, and of course, because it's out there. The problem is we can't see it. So what happens is that new comes into our sense organs, and it reverberates around this thing we have called the brain, and it gets turned into news. That's how we understand most things. And we interpret that news as a dream. So we're familiar with nighttime dreams, but most of us don't realize that we're dreaming in the day. This is why it's hard to hit a baseball, because what we're seeing is not what comes into our retina, but we're seeing a composite thing put together that's about 1/3 of a second delayed. Our brain is taking in lots of things, throwing away most of it, correlating with all the stories we believe, turning it into our walking dream, which most people like to call reality. So McLuhan had a great line here. He said, "Until I believe it, I can't." Get up here. "Until I believe it, I can't see it." And this is much more true than the other. Because seeing is absolutely not believing. It's the easiest thing in the world to fool people. In fact, we love being fooled. That's what theater and show business is all about. Fiction. Telling lies for fun and profit. Okay, so here, I'm going to just move things around. So you notice I'm not using PowerPoint here. So I'm coping with the projection problem that we have. So this system, the authoring is always on. Okay, so the anthropologists, when they started studying human beings, first looked at human differences, and then they realized that these differences come in categories that are common to all of us. So amongst the 3,000 cultures they studied, they found about 300 human universals, including this idea of coping. We're all social. We've all got language. We've got a culture, which is our ways of making a living, staying alive. We all have fantasies, stories, tools, art, technology, etc. We think in very, very similar ways. We all have superstitions, religion and magic, and so on, one after another. Now, one of the ways of looking at our modern age is to realize that if you go to the web and look up human universals, you'll find an anthropologist by the name of Brown who wrote a pretty good book about them. And one of the ways of thinking about if you're a marketing person, thank goodness they don't know anything about anthropology, but if they did, they would realize, you just have to go to a human universal and make a technological amplifier for it, and you can make $1 billion. Because these are the things you can sell. You can sell amplifiers to these things. These are the things. Why? Because we crave them. What's the worst punishment you can give somebody? Solitary confinement. So it's not that we do communicate, we have to. If we take away our dreams and our fantasies and stuff, you're punishing us. So this is a recipe for selling to human beings 101. And if you look at most video games today, there's nothing in them that a cave child of 100,000 years ago would not understand, right? Because they're all about vengeance, which is a human universal. They're all about hand-eye stuff, conflict, fighting, and so forth. So let's take a look at another way of looking at this. And this is something that people can do if they're tired of looking at my pictures up here. If you have 2 quarters or 2 oranges or 2 anything of the same size, it's really interesting. 2 thumbs. Put 1 thumb so it's twice as far away from the other thumb. And the geometry says that on your retina, the further away thumb will be half the size on your retina. But in fact, if you look at them, the further away one is about 80% the size. And so whatever is happening inside of our brain, it's not interpreting what our retina is seeing. You can do this with rulers, and it's called size constancy. So it's a perfect way, in case you think you're perceiving reality, there are dozens of these things you can do to convince yourself that you're not really perceiving reality. Of course, most people hate the idea that they're not perceiving reality, and so they reject this. So here's on your retina. There's what you actually see, perceive. And what's happening here is, again, we've got this structure that I showed, but I've added one more little thing, this pink thing, which you can think of as context or beliefs. So these are things that we've accumulated. So in this case, our genes have never seen a quarter. So this is one of these illusions that comes from learning that these 2 guys are the same size, or oranges are the same size, and so forth. And so this thing knows, quote unquote, that they're the same size, and so it forces this on the dream. And the poor dream has already been modified by what your brain does to these things, and what you wind up with is a compromise that is more towards what your beliefs are than what's actually happening. So new gets turned into news, and the slight difference between these 2 things are what allowed us, after 192,000 years on the planet, to finally discover science. Right? How many have heard of mitochondrial DNA? Okay, so this is inherited only through, we get actually more genetic material from our mothers than from our fathers, because the ova have mitochondria, which are bacteria captured long ago to help produce energy for our cells. So this is only inherited through the mother, and they have now traced human mitochondrial DNA back to find that there was a single mom that we're all descended from about 192,000 years ago. So that's about, now humans have probably been on the planet longer than that, but the ones that lasted came from this one lady. And so 192,000 years, wow, we didn't even start writing until about 5,500 years ago. That's pretty dismal. We didn't do math in a reasonable way like the Greeks did until about 2,500 years ago. We didn't invent science until about 400 years ago. So essentially, from the standpoint of this kind of stuff, almost all the change that's occurred to us has happened in just a few percentage points of our time on the planet. So if we come over here and take a look at, once we've got these things that are built into us, then it's interesting to look at the things that aren't found in every culture. And you can see, well, progress is not found in every culture on the planet, but some cultures believe in it. Ours does. Writing and reading, most people have lived and died without ever writing and reading, but some cultures do have writing and reading. Some cultures have modern mathematics and science. Some cultures think rather than remember. Shouldn't say the whole culture. There's no question that Americans mostly remember rather than think. But if you think about what traditional thinking is like law, it's all based on precedent. This worked in the past. So instead of, when people say, I'm going to think about a problem in the old days, they would try and remember. They would go to the temple and see what was written down in whatever holy books they had, and that's what they would try to apply. That's what they call thinking. So thinking as where you're trying to come up with something from scratch and deduce something out is a very new idea, and so forth. Now, it's interesting that these guys are almost certainly inventions. They're fragile inventions. Some of them were only invented once. And they're highly correlated with the kind of world we want to live in. That's what's important here. And whereas these cultures almost never have anything like a school, it was actually the advent of reading and writing that caused schools to be invented, and the advent of the printing press that caused formal schools in the European and American sense to be created. They didn't exist before then. So a lot of things revolve around these guys that are actually new. Nobody had ever seen anything like them. And just to give you a sense, most Americans read a little bit, but reading and writing is really about being able to read and write about ideas. So the current surveys of the last 10 years show that the percentage of American adults who can read and write about ideas, can learn a real idea from a book, is about 20% of the population. Right, so this idea is penetrated in. It's lower now than it was. And for instance, the number of percentage of Americans that can have a sustained conversation with a scientist about science is about 5%. And if you take all of the scientists, all the mathematicians, all the engineers, and all of the physicians in the United States, they come to far less than 1% of the adult population. So that less than 1% plus the Industrial Revolution is what makes us look like a modern country. India, by the way, has many more people with advanced degrees than the U.S. does, but they have 1 billion people who don't, and they don't have the Industrial Revolution. But intellectually, America looks a lot like India, if you look at how the actual distribution of these things. Most people are just basically coping, getting through their lives, and watching the news on TV, and so forth. Dismal, isn't it? Okay, so here's another interesting way of thinking about this is we've talked about genetic things, but there are these things we can learn. They're kind of like little brainlets. And so when we learn something like this, now here's a good, this one I certainly don't expect anybody here to be able to read Greek, but is there anybody here who has ever seen this before? One person. Where? Oh, yeah, tell me.
4 years of Greek seminary.
Yeah, so what does it say?
Know thyself.
Yeah, know thyself. This is something that probably people said it before Socrates, but I love it. Yeah. So we could take that on, that little thing that is, if we take that on as a really strong part of our context, we're actually act like we've got a little extra brain. And it goes into our dream. And here's one, which is a differential equation. So think about this. It took a genius to invent calculus not too many hundred years ago, but ordinary people can learn calculus. And once you've learned calculus, you can think thoughts that the greatest geniuses of antiquity could not. So this is not a small thing. It's not an addition. It's not news. It is actually new. Once you've made this transition, and it's not done in a day, it's not done by watching television, but once you've done it, you become like what you become when you learn how to read, which is a completely different kind of thinker. So science, I've already talked about. Equal rights, probably one of the hardest invented ideas we've ever come up with. And what computers really are. So these things, as they can add into us, they actually change us as human beings because they change our basic thought patterns. So another McLuhanism, one of my favorite. And of course the goldfish here does not know it is swimming around in pink water because it's never been in any water otherwise. And we can think of that pink water as this context that we think in, and we can think of our thoughts as wandering through this context like an ant. Every once in a while we could have a little outlaw thought, a little thought that doesn't agree with this context, but we've been to school, we go to church, we've internalized a dream that admits certain orthodoxies, which we call reality, and we reject other ones. But every once in a while, when you're in, how many have ever been in the shower or out running or something and had a completely outrageous outlaw idea? Anybody? Yeah. Because they're happening all the time. Now, the problem with these outlaw ideas is, like all ideas, they're generally mediocre down to bad. Most ideas, and just think, because the improbability of a good idea is high. It is very difficult to have a good idea. So most ideas you're going to have, even if you're a genius, it doesn't matter, are going to be crap. So one of the best heuristics you can have is let yourself have ideas and then prune the hell out of them. And this is basically what science is about. So science is a two-level rather than a one. Instead of having dogma, science tries to admit every idea, and boy, it has a hard time doing this a lot of the time just because it's made out of human beings. But the theory is you're supposed to admit everything. And then at the second level, you're supposed to be more critical of those ideas than any human group has ever been critical of ideas before. Right? So those two things, and if you apply them down to humans also. So here's a question. If pink is normal, then what does blue mean?
Not normal.
Yeah, what is not normal? So Korzybski would say it means we're insane. Not normal is insane. So take a look at this. And I'll just point out that it's not that new is different, it's that new is invisible. So the number one thing we have to do is once we realize there is such a thing as new, this is what science was originally all about, was to show there was a zillion things there that we had no idea were there. Once you get that idea, then you can be purposeful about finding it out. And maybe the central thing here for this talk is that for the important things, it takes almost as much creativity to learn the new ideas as was required to invent it. Because we are making these brainlets. We're not adding on to stuff that's already there. We're actually making something. And so the actual process of learning here for the important ideas is vastly different than most of the processes in education and in training. So one way of looking at science is, in the large, is you're given a hairball. This is a particularly disgusting one from a woolly mammoth, so it's like that big. So I'll get rid of it. You're trying to figure out what it is. I'm going to replace it with a star field here, which is prettier, but it's the same idea. Basically, what's out there is essentially a hairball, and what you're trying to do is to find ways of interpreting and understanding what that hairball is in a model that is in terms of things that our brain can use. In this case, Maxwell's equations on a T-shirt tell you a lot about the property of light that's out there. And you want to know what these correspondences are, and things are really a lot murkier and more complicated than those T-shirts. So when computers come in, what the computers are good for here is to unmurk. So as the computers get more and more powerful, we can make better and better models to understand things in more and more detail. And so I won't go through all of the things. Here's a particularly difficult one. We'd all like to know exactly what the climate is doing. It's doing something. And some of what it's doing is not good, but one of the big problems here is one of the big effectors of really good models of the climate happens to be how the clouds materialize and dematerialize. So just think about the clouds largely coming up from the oceans, but also from lakes, and being cast about by the winds and having different reflectivities at different altitudes and stuff like that. So this is really hard to model. So it's ephemeral, and it accounts for a wide variety of differences in the climate models. But eventually they'll get it. And we can do the same. Whoops, there's the hairball again. But let's go to a man-made thing, because science is about phenomena. It doesn't matter whether the universe made it or whether we made it. So if we take a bridge, we can make a T-shirt about bridges. And we can make a truly fabulous bridge to give you an idea of how big this bridge is. Let me just move this up. So this bridge is in Japan, and that is the Empire State Building and the Great Pyramid of Egypt next to it. So this is not a trivial bridge. This is the longest suspension. So it's several miles long between the two pylons here. And this is what makes you proud to be an engineer. You know, there's nothing haphazard about the way they went about doing this. And okay, so Marvin Minsky here points out that despite what McLuhan says, our nervous system wants us to live in the past, but in fact science, these new ways of thinking, allow us to live in the present. The only way we can live in the present is to approach the present as essentially a construction. It's a set of things that we must not allow to go into our dreams and fantasies. And so once we get into the present, we can actually start dealing with things much more the way they are. So the real question in education here is, how can we do this? So one way people have relied on in history is IQ, but imagine being Leonardo and or smarter. Imagine being 3 times as smart as Leonardo, but born in 10,000 BC. How far are you going to get before they burn you at the stake? So IQ is vastly overrated because it really has to be hooked to something. And you go to a guy who's much less impressive than Leonardo, namely Henry Ford, who could make a revolution in transportation, whereas Leonardo, who is 10 times smarter than Henry Ford ever hoped to be, Leonardo was born in the wrong century. He could not invent a single engine for any of his vehicles. Whereas in the 19th century, it was just really easy to invent engines. And why? Because somebody had changed the context, namely Newton. So outlook trumps everything. Knowledge trumps IQ. So you can think of outlook as gold, knowledge as silver, and IQ as something like lead. And the reason is that human IQ, that's that pink matter stuff between our ears, actually isn't smart enough to deal with any of our problems. It never was. This is why cultures built up lore, because we just aren't smart enough to figure out things from scratch when they come up. So just-in-time stuff is a very bad way of thinking about things. You just can't do enough in just-in-time approaches to deal with the real problems of the day. So what you really would what schools are set up to do is to give you knowledge, but what you really want to do is to figure out how to get outlook. It's changes of outlook that make the big changes. So coming back one more time here to this little diagram, we see Leonardo here, Henry Ford in the dream, and Henry Ford is in the dream because of Newton there. So that is what we want to achieve. And here's the problem with doing it in a learning situation, even if you have computers. So in most of the e-learning systems that I've looked at, and certainly the ones that I have done, we can't even do this, which is to deal with the fact that there are about 20 types of learners that we need to. This is just one axis, which is how much help do they need. And these you can think of as the bell curve put on human talents and abilities. So this is, you can think of this as what do they come to the learning with initially? And so for example, the universals, everybody learns how to speak because we're wired for it. So it's very rare, only a small percentage of the population is aphasic. But for the non-universals, we're not wired for them, and so pretty much everybody, except for a happy few up here, need a lot of help with calculus and a lot of help with science and a lot of help with stuff. And these learners, the important idea here is that you don't throw away the ones that need help, but what they need is completely something different. And if you take other dimensions, like the dimensions of motivation, people are differently motivated. Some people are inner motivated, some people are outer motivated, some people want this or some people want that. And so a good teacher who is not completely overwhelmed by having dozens and dozens and dozens of students will try to find the fits of these things. But the computer systems that I've looked at over the last 30, 40 years can't even tell you what your Myers-Briggs type is from watching you interact with your computer. Think about that. So the interface on your computer is not even set up with all the computing power we have to find out the least little things about your particular styles of doing things. So the gap here is enormous. And that gap is the gap that has to be bridged in order for e-learning to really make progress. Discovery learning, which is something we try to do with e-learning, has a real bug in it, and that's this. So this is originally a great cartoon from the 60s. And why are they discovering the wrong things? And the answer is because the greatest geniuses in history didn't discover most of these things until the last few hundred years. None of this stuff is obvious that's worthwhile learning. And so you need something much more than that. You need something like guides. And what you'd like is to have Socrates or Archimedes or etc., Richard Feynman. That's the guide you'd like to have. You'd like to have somebody who, besides knowing a lot of stuff, knows how to make it interesting. And, well, it didn't work out that way, but the combination of books allowed some of what Socrates and Feynman had to be brought to us with more ordinary teachers. Right? The power of books is not just that they have knowledge in them, but style. So some of the style of these great thinkers came along and could affect a little kid. And a great teacher could augment the books with things to do, and maybe there's a parent in there who could be relied on for some advice. And so in the end of this thing, you're basically trying to ask the question as to whether you can put Socrates in a box. But maybe the first question we should ask is how to put what books have meant to us in a box and make these guides a little stronger. So books work by not having to be particularly like human beings, but by embodying some of the things that human beings have. So we can put the Republic of Plato in there. We can add a computer in there. We can do the media stuff that we're all familiar with. We can make our little cars. We can make simulations. We can do all of those things, but what we really need to do is to be able to listen to the answers and be able to judge the answers that people are doing, not for right or wrong, the way most tutoring works, but we need to get that information from the learners to understand what it is that they're doing. So what we really need to do, and this is what is going to, the reason I came here to give this talk is just to get you started thinking about that, it's not going to take 40 years. I used to go around talking about the Dynabook laptop computers. 40 years later, we have them. It's not going to take 40 years to put a real listener, a real watcher in a computer. The big problem right now is that there's no national will for it. Marketing people don't want to do it. E-learning people don't want to do it. This is a very hard problem. And so essentially we're winding up coping rather than trying to make progress. And but our president, before he got involved with all of these distractions, now at the National Academy of Sciences issued a set of grand challenges for the nation. And here's the one that is going to happen because President Obama took it on as part of his personal agenda, and people in Washington are now really thinking about that. And that is, in the next 5 to 10 years, that we will create learning software that is as effective as a personal tutor in every way. E-learning, so if you want a roadmap for what the next 5 to 10 years are going to look like, it's going to be an invention and transition to this kind of thing. The way curriculum is done will be different. It'll be something more like desktop publishing, but by giving advice to a computer entity that is going to make a learning environment out of it. So it's going to be new. When I originally started doing this talk, I started thinking, well, maybe I should try and explain what this is going to be like. And then I realized, well, that is going to be, there are too many new things in a row. So I thought, well, what I'd do is talk about new itself and get you to think about the possibility of what it is that you're doing now as news and valuable, just as news is, but that the real game ahead is going to be about the new. Thank you. Thank you.
Any questions for Dr. Cage?
Yes. Yeah, so he's asking, what am I using to make the presentation? And it's called eToys, and it's a thing that we made for children. So it's a thing in which you can think of it as a combination of what we did at Xerox PARC, a user interface that doesn't require typing, so children can use it, HyperCard, and a few other things. So this is kind of what computing should be like. But if you think about what the presentation systems are like, they're pretty much glorified imitations of the old acetate slides that people used to use. But this is trivial stuff you can do with a computer, and you can handle it on the fly. And then, of course, you don't want any modes, right? So all of the authoring stuff here is done while things are actually operating. You never have to stop anything. So the programming and scripting and other kinds of things that you're doing, and then each desktop is sustained over time. So this is, and the PARC system had unlimited desktops. This is something I wish both Apple and Microsoft had picked up Because if you think of it, you're doing work on many projects simultaneously, and they extend over time. So you really don't want to build up and tear down windows. You want to, and so these projects here show you what I mean. So here's what my talk looks like, and these are not just thumbnails of the things, but if you notice, the slide here is as it was as I last left it. So it's actually showing me the dynamic picture of the slide, and if I want to go somewhere else, I can use it as navigation also. So this is just the simplest stuff that we thought up in the 70s, but it sort of illustrates the thesis of this thing, which is when this stuff came out in the world, only about a third of it got adopted by Apple and Microsoft, and less of that got adopted out in the marketplace. And the reason is that the education did not jump in to ask what is this new thing and how can we help people learn what the new of it is. And so what we've gotten actually is kind of a huge low-pass filter which takes what computing actually is kind of down to a dial tone. So most people are using essentially a tricycle and not even realizing that they don't have a bike. Right? Because tricycles are easy to learn, but they aren't very efficient compared to a bike. Bike is harder, but it's better in the long run. That's the thing. Another question?
Take one more question. I know there are presenters that need to start at 10:10, but I'm sure Dr. Kay will be with us for a couple more hours, but we'll take one more question.
Dr. Kay, you seem to have an appreciation for history, classical thought, and classical music, but at the same time you're known for really paradigm-busting ideas. And I wonder how much investment of your personal life that you spent in gaining that appreciation, if that kind of flies in the face in your ability to...
Yeah, so that is a great question. I've been asked it before, and students ask me. And the key, because this is the hard, so how can you put salt on the tail of new? Right? And the answer is don't do it the way Leonardo did. Right? Where you're trying to do it with sheer IQ, because, on the other hand, if you live in the past too much, your thought tends to be incremental. So what's the and what I tell them is you should learn you should know your field 100% up one side and down the other. Most computer people don't. Like, you should know just everything you can possibly cram into your head from every side, and then you kind of forget it and smell the perfume. In other words, there's that knowledge, besides being explicit, which gets in the way when you're trying to invent something, but it also has a beautiful odor. And that odor is the odor that you make your next creation in the kitchen out of. Because you're starting off by assembling things that are not concrete dishes yet. You're saying, I need odors like these guys. So I'm looking over there, and then there's a point when you put your engineering hat on, that you use just everything in the arsenal, and it also helps you decide what not to use. Like at Xerox PARC, for example, we made the conscious decision that we would not use any vendor's hardware or software. So we built literally every bit of the hardware and software at Xerox PARC ourselves. And of course, that's taking a huge risk. We were pretty cocky about it, but we also were well versed in it, and we decided it would be harder for us to undo, both practically and also in our heads, the thinking that was done at DEC and IBM and stuff. We'd be better off if we just went at it from scratch. So the only thing we bought from chip companies were gates. We just made everything else, and we made all the software ourselves. And that turned out to be the world's greatest boon, because it allowed us to go right at the problems rather than trying to get around old problems that we didn't even want to think about. Because real problems are hard enough. You don't want to convolve them with dealing with old problems. So I also get them to read a biography of Michelangelo. So Michelangelo is one of my heroes because the guy had an incredible talent for thinking of monumental images. Impossible to do things like the image of what the Sistine Chapel ceiling could look like. But most people don't realize that Michelangelo spent more than 4 years, day after day, on his back, painting with a candle stuck in his turban, painting that ceiling himself. And so he spent a few weeks sketching out what the thing was going to be like, imagining it, and then he spent 4 years doing the nitty-gritty stuff. And it's really about that. It's like that. And that's why you don't see a lot of real creativity, because the people who are good at having ideas generally lack discipline. And the people who have gained discipline have too much of it. They can't have a new idea because they worry about whether things work. And so you basically have to be, nutty as a fruitcake about 5% of the time, and tough as nails the other 95% of the time. That's what I tell students. I mean, it's true. I can't say it any other way. And I say, if you don't learn your field, get out of here, because I want them to be able to criticize what's wrong with computing. That's why you learn it, so you can criticize. And then there's maybe 1% of computing that's been done that's good. Thank you.
This has been a production of the Defense Acquisition University, where people come to learn, perform, succeed.